So topic 2 in crime is looking at the collection and the processing of forensic evidence. It is looking at what motivating factors there are and what biases there might be in the way that we collect that forensic evidence, and then the application part is looking at strategies to reduce that bias. So in this I'm going to go through the background and I'm going to go through the key piece of research. So essentially by forensic evidence we mean things which are either like tangible evidence, so solid pieces of evidence like if you find firearms, bullets, drug paraphernalia, computers with evidence on, things like that are kind of solid and tangible. Or you can have kind of what you call transient evidence. So that can be things that might be open to some element of biases like hairs, DNA, body fluids, or what you call latent fingerprints. So latent fingerprints would be fingerprints that have been taken from the scene of the crime, so it's not kind of like solved who that is. You'd have to try and find who that person is from the fingerprints, and that's what we're going to focus on in this kind of collection of evidence, is those latent fingerprints. So for you to kind of get a bit of understanding of how these errors and things can be made and how people can be motivated in collecting this evidence, we're just going to look at fingerprint analysis and what that involves. So make some notes on the main characteristics of a print. So there you've got 3 different fingerprints. Now what we look at in fingerprinting is the ridges usually. So by ridges, they're the lines that you can see. So a ridge is the bit of your finger that kind of sticks up. So that would be your ridge. So each of these lines is a ridge. Now you can see that they're all very different. They're not the same as each other. So I'm going to go over the features of a fingerprint, and I'm also going to go over the different types of fingerprints as well. Also, it's worth saying that these ridges are not continuous, so ridges will break and ridges will divide. Okay, so for example, here these are obviously drawings, but here you can see that you've got what you call ridge endings. So that's when the ridge appears to come to a sudden halt. You've got bifurcation, which is, there's an example here of bifurcation. So this is when the ridge will kind of fork. So it will, one ridge will split into 2. You have got ridge dots. Okay, so they're kind of single dots, or you could have like a couple of dots in a row. But it's not kind of like a full ridge. You can also have short ridges as well. So you can have ridges, short ridges, and ridge dots, and then the ridges will potentially then come to an end, or they will fork off like that. You will also see in actual fingerprints, obviously these are drawings, but in actual fingerprints you will likely see that your ridges can actually cross over one another. So there, like this is an example of bifurcation, because actually we've got here we've got 2 ridges there and we've got 2 ridges at the end, so it's not forked off, but the ridges have actually kind of crossed over each other. So there you can see how that's a little bit different. So it has actually kind of forked off, and there's an example of like a ridge ending, and really you could also, I guess, say that's a short ridge. It's not lengthy, it's on its own. But anyway, so on actual fingerprints, you can also see that actually there are pores. So there's a pore and there's a pore. So they're kind of all over, but they're like sweat pores, basically. Now, sometimes the sweat pores can be quite large, and then that means that it appears that you've got kind of a broken ridge, so like a series of ridge dots or a series of short ridges, but actually sometimes it's just a big sweat pore. So when you're taking fingerprints, you need to make sure that they're quite clean. You also can have things called deltas. So there is one just here, but in this kind of sketch here, it's a clearer example. So a delta is kind of a triangular shape as well. And also you can see that kind of this bit here, that bit there, so where you have your kind of your final ridge in the centre, that's known as your core. So there's lots of features there that you can familiarise yourself with, so make a note on each of those and what they look like. So you may want to pause the video just there in order to do so. Now you've also got 3 main types of fingerprint, and then there are subtypes of these fingerprints. So you know, there's just kind of 3 umbrella types, and then there's several subtypes underneath. So one type is the arch. So in an arch, your ridge starts at one side, the ridge kind of cascades upwards and then leaves at the other side. So for example here, this is an example of one which is an arch. So you can see that the ridges enter, they cascade upwards and then back down and then off to the side and exit on the kind of other side of the finger, if you will. Now arches usually don't have any delta in, okay, so like there's your delta and there's your delta. Usually there's no delta in an arch, and these are the least common type of fingerprint. So usually kind of like roughly 5% of people will have an arch, sorry. Then you have a loop. So loops are where the ridges will enter at one side, and then kind of loop back over and leave at the same side at which they entered. Okay, so you can kind of see here that's a loop. So the ridges enter, they go around, they'll loop round, and then they'll come back on themselves and leave on the same side. Now these are quite common, so this is one of the most common fingerprint types. So like usually kind of 60-70% of fingerprints are loops, and usually they only have one delta. So for example there you can see that's a delta there, so that kind of triangular shape there. So you've got a line there, a line there, and a line there. Can you see? And those kind of 3 ridges make up a delta. And then your last type is the whorl, and that is spelt WHORL. So the whorl. Now that is where you kind of they turn a circuit basically. So you can see it's like a wheel, like a whirlpool, in the form of the ridges. So about 25-35% usually of fingerprints are these, and they usually have 2 or more deltas. So if you look at this one, you can see that there's a delta and there's a delta. So fingerprint analysis has been used for over 100 years. And actually this is used because in theory it should be fairly reliable, in the sense that your fingerprints are unique, so there's no evidence to support that 2 people in the world have the same fingerprints, and even your fingerprints, each finger is different to the other fingers. So if you just kind of look at your fingerprints, then you can see that actually the shapes formed on your finger, on your fingerprints are different to the other fingers, and even kind of like there's identical twins where you know everything about them. Remember, identical twins, they're monozygotic, they share 100% of their genes, and yet their fingerprints are different. What we are going to look at is motivating factors. So motivating factors, factors which motivate. So one of the strongest motivating factors in the collection and the processing of any forensic evidence is the sense of reward from finding evidence that leads to the solving of a crime. So that one seems fairly commonsensical. So you will feel quite rewarded, and therefore that will kind of motivate you to continue if you found some evidence and that supports the conviction of a crime. We also have some evidence to support that your motivation increases if crimes have high emotional context, or there is a need for cognitive closure or consensus. So we'll talk about what each of these mean, really. The only one that we're not going to go into in a lot of detail is that need for consensus. So by the need for consensus, we essentially mean that if there is a desire for like each of the investigating team to be in agreement with each other, then you may be more likely to say yes, that's a matching fingerprint. So that's the only one that we're not going to look at in a lot of detail, but high emotional context and cognitive closure we're going to look at in a bit more detail, as these are some reasons why errors may occur, these motivations. So a cognitive neuroscientist called Draw, like I'm not going to say that that's the right way to pronounce that name, but that's what I'm going to go with, says that the errors made is a result of human error. The source of this error is best explained by psychology and the cognitive bias. So there's a couple of pieces of research that I'm just going to run through with you. So this piece of research is looking at emotional context. So they aimed to examine the effect of that emotional context on fingerprint analysis and how accurate it is. So 27 university students volunteered. 96 pairs of fingerprints were selected from a database. Some of these were ambiguous, so in other words, they were unclear in some way, and others were unambiguous. And therefore, some of them were able to use what you call a bottom-up process, and others we had to use a top-down process. We're going to look at these in a bit more detail later on, but on ambiguous images, so images which were unclear, top-down processes have a greater influence, and we'll learn about what those are a little bit later on. So essentially in this study, the independent variable was a high emotional state or a low emotional state. So they said that the crime was either something quite kind of petty, like a petty theft, so bicycle theft, burglary, cases which weren't harmful to anyone, so there's very little emotion involved in those, or they could be highly emotional states, such as murder, attacks, so more like violent crimes. Photos were used to reinforce this context above, and the DV was the number of matches that were made. All participants saw all 96 prints, so that means that this is a repeated measures design. Generally, what we find here is that there is a significant interaction between the ambiguity of the image and whether participants are influenced by the context of the information that they're presented with. So yeah, if you just kind of look at the table in your notes, you can see the percentage of matches, so that these were where the participants said that the fingerprints were the same as the ones that they were presented with, in the ambiguous compared to the unambiguous pairs. So where the kind of the emotional context is high, in the ambiguous images, then we are like more likely to make those matches even where it is false. Just again, so another one looking at emotional context. So this was actually a more qualitative piece of research. It looked at interviews, and this one used experts rather than students, and they used qualitative questions which tried to examine the motivations for them saying that a set of prints were a match of those found at a crime scene. So they asked some questions like, how did you feel about succeeding in matching the prints? Things like that. Essentially, they came out with 5 key themes that appeared to be motivations. So job satisfaction is one, and that includes having pride in your skill or your ability to match. There was lots of kind of satisfaction related variables in there. So there was things like the satisfaction of catching criminals was a motivating factor, or the longer that a case had been going on for, the more satisfying it was to match the fingerprints. And then there was a couple of emotion-related things, so a need for closure. So the need for closure would be like the need for an investigation to end for one reason or another. And emotions, so how they felt about the idea of kind of making mistakes or making matches emotionally. So what they kind of said was that that you are both emotionally motivated but also influenced by psychological factors, things like satisfaction, and this can potentially lead to errors if the context and the emotion is strong enough. So if you are kind of emotionally desiring this need for closure, so a need for the investigation to end as quickly as possible, then you're more likely to make an error, essentially. There's also some factors related to cognitive errors as well. So there's cognitive closure. So that's what I was talking about in terms of sometimes there's a need for a case to come to an end, so to come to some kind of definitive conclusion. So this piece of research essentially looks at the idea that when the need for closure is high, we're more likely to make quicker judgments more confidently. So we're more likely to say, yes, these fingerprints at the crime scene are a match for this set of fingerprints right here, and we're likely to do that with more confidence. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more accurate, because actually if the need for closure was lower, then the number of possibilities that you would consider are actually larger, and therefore you may think about it more. Your decision process, your decision making process may actually be more thorough and therefore better. So this can lead to something which these researchers coined the unfounded confidence paradox. So in other words, you're more confident in your decisions, but there's no reason, kind of solid reason why you are more confident. You're just more confident because you want to end the case. So what I do want you to look at is the influence of like this kind of contextual evidence now. So contextual evidence is sometimes a motivator in our decision-making processes regarding making matches of fingerprints. So what I want you to do is have a read through the case in your notes of Brandon Mayfield, and what I want you to answer underneath is, why did this error occur? So you can pause the video just here in order to do that. Okay, so now we are going to look at the two processes of fingerprint analysis that I mentioned before. So you've got two processes, the bottom-up process and the top-down process. So in the bottom-up process, that is where The examination of the overall pattern of friction ridges and characteristics is done. So in other words, we kind of zoom in, as it says here, to examine things such as location and distribution of sweat pores, individual ridge technology, so looking for those kind of like ridge endings and short ridges and ridge dots, and other uniquely identifiable features. So in the bottom-up process, it's fairly objective because it's driven by the data. So it's driven by you actually very thoroughly and carefully examining that fingerprint in relation to another piece of fingerprint evidence. However, if the fingerprint evidence from a crime scene is in poor quality, because it's a partial print or because it's smudged or something like that, then actually how objective that process is can be affected by this as well. And then alternatively, you have got your top-down processes. In these top-down processes, you start from the broader picture. So you start by looking at kind of contextual factors, and these contextual factors can actually affect the accuracy of the decisions that you make. So these contextual factors may be like how experienced the analyst is, the knowledge of the analyst, the expectations and the emotional state of the analyst. So in the top-down process, these factors actually then mean that these biases are overriding how objective your decision making is. So perhaps if you were maybe less experienced, then that can override your analysis. Or if you've got kind of expectations of who you think that this person is, this criminal is, or again these kind of the emotional state. So if you are if you have emotions about this case needing to end or something like that, then that can affect and override that decision making process, override those bottom up processes. There's lots of examples here of cognitive biases. These are all in your notes. So you've got observer or expectancy bias, so the expert anticipates the outcome as a result of information from an initial observer. So selective attention. So sometimes your expectations can lead you to kind of filter out certain elements and only focus on those which you think are important. So conformity, so that comes back to that level of agreement that I mentioned earlier on. So if a fingerprint expert is asked to validate the decision of a peer, they may unconsciously show some bias because they may be more willing to agree. Need determination perception, so a strong desire to solve a particular crime, or overconfidence bias, as I mentioned before. So that kind of unfounded confidence in ability. There's also a few more here. So you've got contextual bias. So you may want to add some of these into your notes. So contextual bias occurs when irrelevant contextual information about an event or the way in which some information is presented might influence your reasoning. So sometimes kind of details about the crime or background information about the suspect may affect your decision making. So for example, if you get a really poor quality fingerprint and the crime is very serious, so it's kind of like, again, those kind of high emotion crimes, then you may be more willing to actually say that it is a match, even though it is ambiguous and you can't necessarily tell. Or prior knowledge of that arrested individual would count as this as well. Confirmation bias, so that may be when you interpret information in a way that confirms those pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. So that can kind of lead you to make those false positives as well. Role effects, so experts identify themselves as part of kind of like either a prosecution or a defence team, and then that means that there is a subconscious bias that can influence their decision even where ambiguity exists. And then finally, you've got the use of fingerprint analysis techniques. So basically integrated automated fingerprint identification systems like what's in that image. So basically, as it sounds, this is an automated system, and the idea is that the computer system automatically tries to do the examination and match them up and comes up with a list of potential matches. So you can see that on the image there, that there's a list of like potential matches. Now those lists are ordered in kind of order of relevance. So the idea is that you might show biases there where the people who are responsible for examining if they are a match or not become used to kind of accepting the ones at the top of the list, and less likely to consider the ones lower in the list because you think that they're more relevant and therefore you think that they could be more of a match, more correct. But actually that's not necessarily the case. You just have this increased risk where your expectation of them being relevant means that you have this kind of cognitive bias upon your decision making. So what we are going to just quickly talk about is the cognitive biases shown in the key piece of research. But before we get on to that, again, you'll want to pause the video here, and using all that information that we've just looked at about cognitive biases and things like that, I want you to apply that to the case of the Madrid bomber. So write a paragraph on how cognitive biases might have accounted for the false positive fingerprint match made. So what cognitive biases might there have been out of the ones we've just talked about, and how could they have had an effect? Okay, and then we're just going to look at the key research by Hall and Player. So the idea is, in terms of background, now this isn't in your notes, but you could add this, is that accurate analysis of a fingerprint relies upon the ability of the fingerprint examiner. And if you've got fingerprints which are ambiguous, so they're incomplete, they're smudged, they're distorted, or they're rotated, or something like that, then that can reduce how accurate that analysis is. So often, two experts will kind of independently from one another assess whether they're matches or not, in order to establish that quality of matching. And the idea is that the more expertise you have, so the more able you are, the less likely you should be to make mistakes, but experts do still make mistakes. And some of those things can be due to cognitive biases and can be due to things like the fact that a lot of fingerprinters often get to see the kind of the crime scene investigation examiner report. And that initially, reading that before even looking at the fingerprints, introduces some immediate bias, potentially based upon who they think the culprit is, but also things like the type of crime can affect this. So Hall and Player, essentially this is the fingerprint that they used. So they used a £50 note with a fingerprint on it, so you can see the finger mark just there. So essentially you can kind of follow this in your booklets. So I'll just scroll up and just talk you through it. So it's all in your booklet essentially, but if you just have a look, you can see that this study aims to see whether that written report that you routinely get supplied with, is that going to affect your identification of a poor quality print. So you could see in that previous slide that it was a poor quality print, and are you emotionally affected by those circumstances of a crime? So we have 70 volunteers who work for the Metropolitan Police Fingerprint Bureau. Their length of experience ranged from less than 3 months to more than 30 years, and the mean length of experience was 11 years. And the majority are active in teams dealing with a full range of crimes. So they all responded to a request to take part in the experiment, but the details were not disclosed. So this is classed as a field experiment, and it uses an independent measures design where participants were randomly allocated to conditions. So they took a volunteer, so another person whose right forefinger was inked and printed onto paper, so we actually knew who this fingerprint belonged to. And then it was scanned onto a computer and it was superimposed on the corner of a £50 note. Okay, so it was planted upon the £50 note, and then 14 prints of this were made. So this ensured consistency, so standardisation of the fingerprint given. So they were also shown to a sample of practitioners who agreed that this fingerprint was ambiguous. So they were given one of the 14 printed finger marks. They were given 10 fingerprints from who they were claiming was the suspect. The crime scene examiner's report, and a sheet of paper advising participants of the context, so the context of the crime and things like that. So, as I say, they tried to make this as naturalistic as possible, so they were randomly assigned in groups of 8 and were asked to treat this experiment as they would a typical day. So they could talk to each other and things like that, but they weren't allowed to actually discuss the finger marks, so they weren't allowed to kind of bias each other in any way. But other than that, it was fairly naturalistic as an experiment, and they could consider it for as long as they wanted. So all quite naturalistic. In terms of the independent variable, that is whether they were given low emotional context or high emotional context. So in the low emotional context, participants were basically told that it was an act of forgery, which is what you'd consider a victimless crime. So in other words, they had entered a premises and tried to pay for something with a forged £50 note. The forgery was spotted and the suspect then left the scene. Okay, so in other words, they tried to commit an act of forgery, but were not successful, so nobody actually suffered the consequences of that crime. Or there was high emotional context, so they were given a report that refers to murder. And the wording on the examination report read that the suspect fired 2 shots at the victim before leaving the scene. So obviously, like I said, one's high emotion and one is low emotion. So anyway, yeah, you can read through this in more detail in your booklets. But essentially, what they had to do was decide upon several factors. So they were asked to consider whether the fingerprint on the note was a match with the sample of 10 fingerprints they were given, or not a match, whether they thought that the information was insufficient, so they thought that there was not enough detail to even make a comparison, so to even try and compare, or whether they thought that there was some detail in agreement, so that there was kind of insufficient detail to establish that I was definitely the person, but there was some details to suggest that it could be that person. And then after this, they were also given a post-experiment questionnaire. So in this, they were asked questions like where they worked, how experienced they were, and had they ever presented information evidence in court, and that's where we kind of got all that sample information from. But they were also asked whether or not they had referred to the crime scene in like examination report, and if they had it affected their analysis in any way. So the overall findings really are that a total of 57 of the 70 participants indicated that they had read it. 30 of those 57 were in the high context group compared to 27 in the low context group. So 18.6% of experts, or 19%, if you're rounding up, said that they had not read the report. Now, 52% of the 30 who had read the high context scenario had said that they did feel like they were affected by the information in the report in terms of how they had analysed that information. And that is significantly greater than those who had the low context scenario. So in comparison, only 6% of them said that they felt affected by it. Now, if you look at the actual results in terms of how they categorised those fingerprints, what you can see from this data here is that even if they were given the high context, so the kind of the serious crime, the final analysis was not actually affected. So actually you can see we're coming out with fairly similar numbers in terms of the final outcome. Now, none of those numbers are significantly different from one another. So even where the experts said that they thought that their analysis had been affected, overall the numbers suggest that it hasn't been. So that might suggest that actually experts are less affected than non-experts when it comes to like emotional context. And that's kind of, why Draw's research may have found something different, because they use non-experts compared to these experts. And also remember that 19% of these participants said that they didn't even read the report because they thought that it was surplus to requirements. So actually they didn't need to know that information in order to establish whether this was a match or not, so they usually don't bother reading it. So for those participants, it couldn't have affected them anyway. So all of that information is in there. So they concluded that it does affect the expert's feelings, but it doesn't affect the final outcome. So this might show that the experienced fingerprint experts are better at doing analyses in a detached manner than non-experts. So in other words, not allowing the context to actually affect them in any particular way. Okay. And we'll pick the rest of this up in lesson.